Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Ali Dearborn joins me to discuss polyvagal guided therapy and sex education for autistics. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Ali, I know we had some technical issues, but I'm really glad to have you here and to learn a little bit about your story.
Me too. I'm glad we worked through the tech problems there, and here we get to be. So
Absolutely.
excellent.
Absolutely. So, in starting our conversation, I'd love to learn, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
The way my autistic brain works is sort of like there's like multi-level responses to any one question, right? So I think in an official kind of like material reality way, my journey with the autistic community started just in May of 2022. But I can see just from another level of consciousness that just in my journals and dream kind of work over the past 6 years now, since I've been in kind of a formal recovery, personal recovery for my own trauma and addiction history, there was this kind of indicator, I think, really deeply showing up in my dreams for years now. And just like this recurring theme of being in places that now I can recognize were places where I was most sensorially overwhelmed and spent the most time trying to mask. So, like this kind of recurrent dream of being in shopping malls, bars, dressing rooms, bathrooms, school buildings, traveling in airports, missing a plane, just like these kind of same recurrent patterns. And the more my conscious level of autistic identity has unfolded, I mean, of course, the more I realize like I've always been in the autistic community and have, like most of the people that I know and love and have stayed in my life the longest are also members of the neurodifferent kind of community in some form. And, but really just on a kind of personal, professional identity level, just last year, and it has significantly changed so much about my own conception of myself and what I'm capable of doing. And it's certainly something I love to discuss. So I'm thrilled to get to be here and have this opportunity to talk about it with you.
Absolutely. With some guests in the past, we've talked about the polyvagal theory from time to time. So I'm really interested to talk to you, as you're a polyvagal guided therapist. So, how do you help your clients understand themselves through the polyvagal guided therapy that maybe other forms of therapy or other therapists don't use?
Okay, so for me, and just what I'll share with you and the listeners here is that kind of I have this sort of the personal is political, which is sort of a tenement of my feminism. In some way, that's all pieces together, even with the autistic identity and kind of realization. Because for me, I started to get introduced to polyvagal theory when I kind of reemerged in 2020 from a period of burnout, and took about 3 years off from working in the field. And the more I started to work again clinically with clients, of course, the more I realized, like, which was during COVID, a lot of a lot of really big reactions people were having. And it's like I just really wanted to kind of refresh my learning. And I've always had an interest in the neuroscience and that kind of interpersonal neurobiology kind of methods, like Dan Siegel, but always found the learning the language a little bit clunky and difficult. And so I ended up kind of researching a lot about kind of just healing complex trauma, and came across polyvagal theory and ended up doing a training with Deb Dana, who I think does just a beautiful job kind of translating the work of Stephen Porges into an understandable form, like kind of more layman's terms. And in the exploration and learning of polyvagal theory, which she teaches in a very experiential way, what I came to really embrace and truly love about the model of polyvagal is that it is a deeply embodied wisdom source. Like, this is inside of us. And as an autistic person, right, like sometimes there are challenges with understanding the inner world, or kind of making sense of all the different inputs that we might be fielding and understanding, kind of taking in what beyond our awareness or not. And so the basic concepts of polyvagal theory really just started to make more sense to me than anything else I'd been exposed to clinically. And that it takes you back into the body, like that there is this kind of process of starting to listen, to kind of one of the basic teachings is like that we come to kind of like notice and name that there are distinct states of our nervous system that can move in a very predictable fashion, and that you can use scientific kind of inquiry, which really appeals to me, to like quite literally start to map and understand like what state we mostly exist in, what takes us to, kind of other states, what helps us regulate, like what we do on our own, how we regulate with others. And in the process of learning the polyvagal theory so that I could apply it to my practice, I start really recognizing some of the differences between what my series of maps look like than what other people's maps look like. And at this point, I'm in a process of being several years into my own kind of personal recovery as, someone that had identified as being and having sex and love addiction and kind of, really difficult trauma bonding relationship patterns kind of happening. And so I kind of went into this recovery process and had been seeing everything through a trauma lens, and like, and conceptualizing the ways in which I'm different from what other people kind of find as resourcing, or what other people really light up around, even in a recovery process, was sort of different than my real felt and embodied experience. And the understanding of those things kind of helped me create a life like that actually worked for me, like that this looking at like what actually helps support me in feeling more connected, more safe, and at ease. And for me, that those experiences came much more through activities like building a moss garden, or reading the entire 14 book series of the Wheel of Time in about 3 months, just, it's like that, like I found enjoyment in things that were really rather solitary, or if I was going to seek community, have, like an activity based thing, like, I could go do an art class and then I'd like to, retreat from the socializing. It's just like kind of this window of looking in at, now I can understand just how my autism even was really becoming more known to me without having the words for it, but the sense of like kind of what actually works and what my system's responding to. And so much of that is also about sensory cues and the environment that we're in, and attending to cues of safety, which is my favorite way of really working professionally with clients, is like the polyvagal theory teaches that safety is the treatment. From that foundation, like we're looking to kind of create just like micro moments of finding what does that safety mean again. And it might be the sound of the breeze, or it might be just being tucked in your bed with a particular blanket, or it might be a certain bird call, or it's like what is the things that kind of help light up that little bit of safety, and we start to kind of craft and really attend to that. But I think it's just the most exquisitely sensitive way of looking at how we and our bodies and ourselves are kind of in interaction with the environments we're in. And I think just as neurodifferent folks, right, that is absolutely something that's imperative for us to
Yeah.
understand in order to find more wellness. I hope that's coherent. That's a
There
big ramble.
there were so many great things that you said, particularly you said safety is the treatment, which I think is so key. Just for me, like example, there's so many things where I don't feel safe. Like for example, if someone rings my doorbell or knocks on my door, in the only place I feel safe in this world, my home, like I freak out. I just refuse to answer the door anymore. If I don't know you're coming and you come and knock on the door, ring the doorbell, I'm not answering. So, can you maybe talk a little bit more about safety being the treatment?
Yes. I mean, I love that example that you just gave, and because like there's something about that it's like the unexpected, which for those of us with autism or neuro differences, it is like there is something about that like outlier to what my predictable, how I find safety. So one of the ways that we kind of monitor how we build safety, and part of this is embedded in the nervous system's like kind of natural ability to shift between states, like that we are built to shift and flow between at ease and mobilized and maybe a little overwhelmed and then going into rest and then we come out, but when we end up having experiences where what the polyvagal teaches us cues of danger start to outweigh kind of these cues of safety, where we're kind of being met with more demands than we actually have that kind of internal capacity to field and navigate or buffer from, we kind of start to get more dysregulated. And so there's a learning about what it is that triggers me, what it is that takes me out of that feeling of in my bubble and safe. So it's like kind of if we were mapping together to be like, okay, clear trigger, unexpected visitor to my front door. I feel the same way about phone calls. It's like if like
Yeah.
like it's just like anything. It's like we're not schedule a call. It's like the like I do have reactions, and the more we can just kind of start to notice and list like, okay, what are those things that start to take me out of my kind of sense of being more at ease. And then contrary, like, because part of the polyvagal theory and I think any integrative health healing work recognizes that we also, it's like not enough just to identify cues of danger. Like what's necessary is to also start to tune the system, which is like toning the ventral vagal to start to track, attend, to really look for the cues of safety, because naturally we're wired to, from the survival mechanism, to kind of, if there's a neuroception or sort of a unconscious or even conscious cue of danger that arises, we're wired to then start to attend to any other cues of danger and kind of be able to sort of try to protect ourselves. But when we're in that state, the work in therapy and the work with polyvagal theory is to start to kind of recognize, right, like, okay, what are the ways in which I can be safe? What are the things that help bring what Deb Dana teaches is like just a micro moment of at ease, again, so we're back to like, like kind of that breath, the little exhale. And the more we can find the conditions and cues of safety, the more we can start to build on that and use that as like kind of a platform to kind of grow in many ways, like kind of our resiliency factors, because there is the capacity for neuroplasticity, for growth, for change, like trauma. My own therapist says a lot that trauma is what happens to us, and kind of our recovery or our healing is about what we choose. And so there is something about that. I could pay attention to like, whoa, that noise really dysregulated me, and then where, what helps bring a little glimmer of ease. It's like, there's my plant, there's my, like, where we can kind of reorient around what's safe. And then build that capacity to kind of bring ourselves like a little bit more regulation so we don't get dysregulated for quite as long. Maybe we don't stay down as, maybe we don't slide as far. Maybe it doesn't happen quite as often, but like really attending to when we're okay, and I think a lot of the work I do is around noticing our gifts and our strengths, right? Because there's going to be things that we're not doing that well at. There are going to be things that are maybe challenging. We're always pushing our growth edge to some degree, but where are we also okay? And that emphasis and really kind of tracking that together and bringing that sense of this also matters. This is also true is, maybe one way to kind of describe a little bit of that.
Now, you're also a certified sex addiction therapist trained in attachment focused EMDR, whose practice is on supporting women with sex, love, codependency, and other addictive patterns. So, for women out there that may benefit from what you do, what may be some signs that they may have some addictive patterns in their lives, and it could be really helpful for them to seek help.
Okay. Yeah. So addiction is absolutely a big part of my own lived experience. And so the working with kind of that propensity towards what might be addictive potential, kind of addictive possibilities, you kind of rides on a like a bit of a spectrum. Like, so there can be sort of like this, just the beginnings of little bit extra preoccupation, a little more kind of your mental energy thinking about this process, behavior, substance that's going to add a little bit of relief, and then sometimes in terms of addictive behaviors, like maybe things start to shift or change, or there's a little escalation, or we start getting involved in more like ritualistic behavior patterns, or being a little more in fantasy than in reality, or kind of being a little more involved out there as opposed to kind of inside or in our life, with people we're with, like like there's sort of this can become like kind of this consuming process. But like what I think differentiates addiction from, to some degree, what I'm now understanding is also a really neurologically designed brain to hyper focus, fixate, loop around things. It's like kind of the differential, because to some degree some of the behaviors that I engage in could be called quote unquote addictive. It's like I love learning, like I can spend hours, right? But it's like the differential is, is this helping me or causing harm? It's like at some level, even from a polyvagal standpoint, when we're engaging in a behavior that has that capacity to become addictive, it's because it's serving some function to help regulate a system that is dysregulated, whether we're in a dorsal and need stimulation to be amped up and start seeking caffeine and nicotine, or, stimulation or risky behaviors, or if we're in kind of a chronically sympathetic and start looking for benzodiazepines or down, kind of drinking, or kind of ways to sort of track the system into a more relaxed state. It's like when those things start to serve as then the only thing that kind of regulates us and ultimately isn't like deeply embedded in kind of a behavior that's got a wellness orientation to it, like that there is some capacity that we can need some help. And I think for me, as someone that struggled with a myriad of addictions, there are some in which it really did require intervention and professional help in order to stop the behavior. And I think that's where there's something around like that quality of like losing control. It's like that we're no longer operating in our own value system, within our own kind of internal compass of like being at ease. Like the thing that we're seeking for is actually causing more stress and distress. And I think that's often certainly kind of more of those crisis indicators that we want to get help. But it is a process that we can support and stop. And sometimes, at least for me as a neurodivergent person, it kind of involved figuring out like how to shift the interest. Essentially, like an addiction can be like a very intense special interest area, which can be very enriching or take you into a really dark culture, subculture, and kind of dangerous place. And so there's this kind of, again, back to choice. It's like, where can we find the capacity to start to choose what takes me closer to actually feeling at ease, kind of like what actually does help me, even in alignment with my longer term goals or desires. We can kind of rewire a pathway towards more help seeking, truly regulating behaviors than some of the things that the addiction can cause.
Now, I'm wondering about the education of certified addiction therapists as it relates to the understanding of our autistic experience. So, are there possibly some common traits us as autistics have that look like sex addiction but may not be at all?
Well, yeah, yes, for sure. And I think, the thing that I'm really delighting in at this point is being able to start to provide some psychoeducation for other CSATs and people in the ITAP community, which is the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. And a colleague of mine, Candace Christiansen, who runs a neuro-inclusive healing center in Salt Lake City, and I did a presentation back in April for the ITAP symposium around seeking safety, love addiction, or seeking safety, kind of focusing on really looking at women, because that's my specific interest area and my lived experience. Because a lot of what I'm tracking, again, in my own personal experience, having been a person seeking professional help for my own sex and love presenting type of issues and concerns, we end up getting misdiagnosed and mislabeled with other mental health problems, or more commonly borderline personality disorder. And when we're getting diagnosis that doesn't actually encompass the full picture of where the chaos in some form is coming from, we aren't able to provide the appropriate treatment. And so in any case, like in any sort of addictive process, like I think even just sharing more about my own story, my first interface with therapy was as a 14-year-old adolescent that developed an eating disorder that escalated into anorexia. And I received support and help for that, and then kind of shifted into more bulimic behavior and substance use and kind of higher risk sexual situations, and then increasingly more chaotic relationships. Kind of each layer of me working through kind of another part of an addictive channel for myself, like now I can kind of look back and recognize that had I been flagged as possibly autistic or at least ADHD back in 1994, like what might have been different, because there are differences between what it is that supports us in healing or even understanding ourselves. And I think as a person that was 5 years into my own personal recovery for sex and love addiction, I was facing to some degree a lot of shame about why I wasn't like other people yet. Kind of, if I have this idea or the diagnosis is that you're traumatized and you're depressed and you're anxious, and we're going to rule out borderline personality for you, and we're going to rule out dependent personality for you. It's like, it's just such a load of like more and more of this like pathology and the what's wrong. And so if I'm following all the rules, I do everything that my recovery team tells me to do, I go get trained in the modalities that my recovery team engaged with me around, but I still don't really want to date. I don't like to be alone, like need a lot of sleep, don't enjoy group situations, and it's like, okay, do I just have more trauma to heal? Like, is that the lesson in this? Like, is there just, maybe I'm just not quite healed yet, and once I'm healed, I'll find ventral and all the things that everybody else seems to find ventral in. But no, like, being autistic does lend itself to realities of other needs and wants and desires and things that are important. I think if we folded that in, had appropriate assessment and diagnosis in treatment centers specifically, because so many of us adult, never diagnosed females, like, come in a big crisis. Like, life has fallen apart. Like, I couldn't work. I was on medical disability leave for years. It's like I really did a number on myself. And that's not an uncommon experience. Like, it crosses all clinical literature, and we need support, but we need the right support. Like, I've been in therapy for 30 years and have a master's level with nearly 20 years post-license experience and a lot of specialized training, and no one had ever presented even the possibility of being autistic. And to me, that is something to grieve. What I do with the things that I discover for the course of the way I am living my life is that I, like, try to apply that. Like, okay, what can I do to help? And for me, being able to have more even understanding, assessment, appropriate diagnosis, like, lends itself to be able to create treatment centers and spaces for autistic women or men or other genders that need support, that do get overwhelmed in the kind of present settings and kind of require maybe a different structure and a lot more sense, like, management of the sensory, which is something that is rarely assessed or looked at or acknowledged as a thing. Even though you have a schedule, like in kind of treatment center settings, like, there were a lot of inconsistencies with doctors canceling, or this, something else happens. And so you kind of kept missing your appointments. Or for me, like, there were broad age range and kind of the treatment center I attended. And I got so dysregulated primarily by younger peers breaking the rules that I would get extremely upset and angry and kind of fixated on it. But then staff is perceiving me through the lens as someone that's got borderline personality and can't manage my anger and is being manipulative. And that is so invalidating and really did some lasting damage for me, even as a mental health professional, in finding the ability to kind of start to trust again. Like, who can I go to for help when who I'm going to for help might be kind of indicating that my inability to control my anger is the problem. It's like, well, how about the fact that people are breaking the rules in what's supposed to be a really regulated place for me to feel safe, like a completely different frame. So yeah, I love the question. It's probably a huge info dump. I hope there's some nuggets of things that kind of make sense in that, but I think it really is meaningful. And from what I can kind of garner so far as a clinician, there's very few places outside of my colleagues' center that I'm aware of that really do a good job attending to neurodivergent people. And, like, so that networking community, I'm absolutely interested in growing, because we need to be out there.
You were talking about psychoeducation, and growing up, I don't think I received much sexual education, and I especially think for us as autistics, that is, very harmful. So, would there be some ways that you might suggest for us as autistics to learn about healthy sexuality and relationships?
Oh my goodness. This is such a near and dear topic to my heart. And it's one that I'm still working on kind of coming up with answers for. I think prior to my kind of burnout, autistic burnout crisis leading into recovery, the place I am now, I worked for a decade with a renowned rape treatment crisis center in the Los Angeles area, where the bulk of my job was to go out into the community and provide sexual violence prevention education for young people and for administrators, teachers, parents, kind of starting to educate communities. And as someone that psychoed, prevention ed, it's like I think for me, like, the best we can do is work towards better prevention. So what that means is accurate information, and I think really involves, especially with young people, a real attention to media literacy, which is not something that most adults even are taught. Like, it was a special interest of mine in college, and the Media Education Foundation, which is based in Massachusetts, does like an incredible job with just this concept of how we teach young people or adults to like critically examine what it is that what's actually being sold through this message, right? Like, what's the set of the scene? Like, what is this actually? What's the story? What's the fantasy? What's the thing that this is kind of telling us is the norm, And I think, knowing what I know through lived experience as an autistic person, and which then of course matches the literature, it's like so much of what we take in to try to learn what's the way to be and what's normal is through media. And I am just immensely grateful that I was born in 1979 and grew up with very different media selection choices than what our youth have to face today. And so in terms of like healthy sexuality and relationships, there's something about like the human connection. I think, like, can we talk about what we're taking in this movie? Can we have some education about, what we're seeing? If you run into internet pornography, it's not a model for what healthy sexuality is like for people. It's like that we actually need to teach boundaries, consent, autonomy, but like these are things that can't just necessarily be taught from like top down. It's like there is this process of having these things kind of modeled, and so it's like our teachers, our parents, our caregivers, like nurturing figures, like, it's like, who can we get that kind of modeling from, that you matter, and so does this other person matters, right? And like, what, and kind of like, what do you like and what do you not like? It's like a very step by step kind of process of like coming into an embodiment of like what works for me, where my boundaries and edges are, that don't necessarily even have to be sexual things. Certainly when we come into the sexual realm, there is a lot of programming and conditioning that sells a story, like this is what you're supposed to do, and if you do this, then these things will happen, and we need other advice channels and kind of suggestions. Like, we need full scripts to navigate a range of situations. It's like there's a lot that can help, but for me, critically examining what we're seeing and kind of to some extent being like programmed to think as is normal, and like what's my actual felt response, kind of back to polyvagal theory. It's like, is this dysregulating for me, or is this regulating for me? Like, does this bring me a cue of safety, or is this a little bit of a cue of danger? And that, like, we teach people how to really listen. Like, if there's some danger, that's a message to be curious about it, and what does it mean? There can be a lot of potential to be being told something that's not lining up with how we're actually feeling on the inside, or pressure to be doing something we're not actually feeling on the inside, and being able in some way to be given permission that what you feel on the inside matters. And healthy relationship involves kind of rupture and repair, and like that's a dual process. Like, both people are engaged, like there's a volley, like that things need to be reciprocal. And I think that's a piece that no one really taught me. It's kind of like, well, there's this idea that if I keep doing what the other person wants me to do, then they'll like me and be my friend and start to do those things back. Like, there's an unspoken assumption that other people are going to be utilizing the same operating system as I am, and that is not true. Like, that is so not true, and so it's like, yeah, like, what's the story, the message, what's the felt experience, like what actually brings me to safety and ease in all my relationships, sexual or not. There's a dynamic at play there that I think is important. And as someone that chooses at this stage in the game to not be sexual with another person, it's also just kind of like, even safety with self, right? Like kind of what turns me on, what's my arousal, what are the conditions of safety that I enjoy establishing for myself for sexual release or just for being in ventral, like being in a state of calm and paying attention to what helps light up that space of feeling good and connected. I think that matters.
So you just said something that I want to ask you a question on, but I don't know if you're comfortable talking about it on a podcast, so we can edit out. So
Okay.
one of the most important values to me is autonomy. I say autonomy all the time. And I'm wondering about that in terms of pornography, because when one chooses to watch pornography, we're thinking exclusively about our need in that moment. How do you think that impacts people in relationships and in sexual encounters when they are watching pornography on a regular basis?
Well, I mean, in my experience and kind of where I track with the clinical research literature, any type of objectification, so where there's like someone else becoming a tool for one's own pleasure or use, right? Like kind of this sort of basic concept of like objectification, which I think is inherent in a media like pornography, then I believe kind of has this inherent detachment from seeing the other in a sexual relationship or interaction as actually being a whole person. Like quite often they're literally reduced to parts, like, and in most cases treated with a lot of nurturing or kindness, or even sort of a conversation about, so kind of a autonomy being again a dynamic, like that I have my autonomy to know what I like and dislike, but that does not exempt or breach your autonomy to know what it is that you like and dislike.
Mm-hmm.
And so there has to be, it's like kind of, I think pornography just like it literally separates a pleasure, an experience of someone kind of reaching sexual pleasure, but it's not engaged with another person, which has its own safety parameters in terms of sensory and navigating a relationship and all of these things. But there is an objectification to it, like that the act is over when you're done or when you're bored or when you're ready to kind of move forward. And it's not kind of engaging in like a dynamic of even learning more about how you might respond to other types of inputs or feeds. It's very singular dimensional. It's like it's kind of got one goal, and I think it lacks a lot of the other dimensions and capacities that a power like sexuality can really potentially embody if given full expression. It's like seeing a narrow slice of kind of like this very distorted view of what it means to be sexual being that really doesn't allow, even for, especially for young people that kind of grow up watching it as like a normal source of sex education in media or involuntary exposure because their peers are watching it or whatever. It's like there is this kind of element of the way it seeps in to how people start to view peers in school, seeing other people as parts, that then there's sort of this kind of wired arousal around. It's like the very interesting process that can start to take place for folks that I think causes harm, because ultimately it's like corrupting what can be a really beautiful form of intimacy into making it something that's like about getting something from someone else as opposed to something that's like truly mutual.
And beyond this wonderful conversation, how can our listeners learn about you and the things that you do?
So I have a website that by my own design I'm findable on. So that is www.allydmft. So that's ALYDMFT.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn at the same allydmft.com. I think I'm searchable on LinkedIn through that. And my website has my email as a neurodifferent person. I think we mentioned this earlier. It's like, don't call, please email. and I'll schedule a call. Like that works so much better for my nervous system, and yeah, I'm happy to, consult, email with folks, but I have a fairly low profile in terms of what I'm able to maintain. So there's no social media or anything. And I'm not an active poster even on the LinkedIn, but there's always room to grow.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Allie. Really appreciated getting to know you and learning from you.
Yes, I am just, yeah, thank you, Doug. I'm excited about what you do. I've been really enjoying listening to the other guests you've had on the podcast and kind of creating a list of people I want to network with. And so I just love what you're offering, and again, the energy you bring and the cues of safety that you've kind of offered for me and just the whole experience. So thank you.
Thanks so much to Allie for the conversation. To learn more about Allie and her services, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. At Autism Personal Coach, our clients are the experts, our coaches are the guides. The majority of supports for autistics are not helpful. They try to fix us, not support us. That's why many are confused when we say our clients are the experts, experts of their lived experience. Our clients are the experts for what's worked for them and about the things they need and want in their lives. Our coaches first listen to our clients, then ask thoughtful questions, offer resources, and strategize with our clients so they can get what they need to thrive. Would you like a guide in your life to coach you to get the things that you desire? If so, visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could please tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.